Here we are, Brandon, rolling again.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, good morning. And good morning to you. Thank you for tuning in. This is Ridgeview's podcast, where we try to talk about all things hope, healing, and recovery. I always like to ask folks to make sure that you subscribe, hit that bell so that you're notified of our latest weekly upload. And don't forget to make note of our COVID helpline that is always before you on the screen. As we mention every time, it is a service provided through our COVID response team, and it's available 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day of the week. Trained counselors are available to listen to you, validate you, and help network you with steps to address how COVID is impacting you. So make note of that. Brandon, it's good to see you again, buddy.
Yes, sir. Same to you.
Yeah, I'm glad we have an opportunity to do this again. So you sent me some information that I thought was really compelling and worthy of our discussion. So I wanted to share with you a statistic that is part of our COVID counseling program, what we offer to the community. I think the actual presentation is loaded to our YouTube page that people can watch. Now, this was pre-COVID.
Okay.
So January 2020, before we lived through the rest of the year. This was an article entitled "Most Americans Are Lonely and Our Workplace Culture May Not Be Helping." Now, in this article, there are a couple stats here. I'll read these quickly. More than 3 in 5 Americans are lonely, with more and more people reporting feeling like they're left out, poorly understood, and lacking companionship. There's been a nearly 13% rise in loneliness since 2018. Pervasive loneliness has widespread effects and is strongly linked to mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. And then lastly, social media use was tied to loneliness as well, with 73% of very heavy social media users considered lonely, as compared to 52% of light users. Now, this is pre-COVID. We see this phenomenon permeating our culture and society. Then COVID hits, and we are asked to mask, cover our face. Mm-hmm. We're asked to socially distance ourselves, and for a period of time, we're given stay-at-home orders, quarantined, a version of it. Is it any wonder that loneliness may have gotten worse? So you sent me what I thought was this clever thought around a double pandemic, COVID-19 and isolation. Where did this idea come from?
So actually, I was listening to a series of behavioral health podcasts about a week ago, and somebody in one of those podcasts, just in passing, used that phrase, double pandemic, and they didn't elaborate on it at all. So it caught my attention, and I went to Google and typed in the phrase double pandemic, which, if you're interested, will bring up a plethora of different search results, all of which are pretty fascinating. But about 2/3 of the way down the first page, it gets into behavioral health results. And so I just started opening pages, reading information, and took some of that to what it meant to me, which actually goes back to your stats. So this idea of double pandemic and how it's affected people's isolation and loneliness pre-COVID to now. So I thought it was a relevant topic for us to talk about, given the current affairs that we're dealing with, and trying to go into a new year with a new glimmer of hope.
Yeah, well, we certainly need that. Yes, I agree with everything that you've said, and I guess, I've been perplexed by this whole messaging around social distancing, and I get it. I support the meaning behind it, but the it's almost like part of it is misnamed. Uh, Physical distancing instead of social distancing. Do you think people experience it that way?
I think it can be. Well, let's go back a little bit. I think 2020 was incredibly overwhelming for almost all of us, if not all of us. And then we added that element into it. And I think when everything first sort of rolled out around COVID 19, all we heard was socially distancing. We didn't really hear alternative phrases. We didn't hear alternative suggestions. We just heard these are the steps you need to take as precautions. And I think that got ingrained in us pretty quickly that we needed to stay away from people, right? And maybe you felt good about doing that because you felt like you were protecting your health or the health care of a loved one. Maybe you felt guilty because you were missing a birthday party or a wedding because of that. Um, but I feel like we didn't take the time as a country to really back down from that term of socially distancing until pretty late in the year. And I think physical distancing is a much more appropriate term because we need social interaction as human beings. You came loaded with your statistics. I came with a quote that I thought was very, very relevant to this. It's from Desmond Tutu, and he said that a person is a person through other persons. You can't be human in isolation. You are only human in relationships. Um, I think that's a beautiful quote, and it speaks to human nature, but it doesn't talk about how we connect with others and alternative options that we have. So I think physical distancing is really important to highlight versus socially distancing.
Yeah, that is a great quote. I love that. I mean, we've talked about before in other settings. From birth, we're hardwired for connection, for relationship. At first, with a primary caregiver, a parent, and that just grows and evolves over time into family and into community, and so it is. I mean, again, I understand, what the intent of the messaging was, but I think it didn't fully appreciate or value the importance of socialness, and I think that was a lost opportunity.
Absolutely.
So, what are you? Tell me what you're seeing out there with folks that you care for, that you work with, as they wrestle with this double pandemic, with the isolation aspect of it.
So one of the biggest detriments that we've actually seen is probably a loss of structure, routine, normalcy. And with this isolation, quarantining, self-stay-at-home orders, all those things, I think one of the things that people may not realize is that it can take an overall impact on your behavioral health as well as your physical health. So you have conditions that are not being treated because you weren't seeing doctors for a while, or you were not experiencing regular coping skills that you had through social support systems, right? And so we saw elevated anxiety, we saw increased depression, we saw chronic health conditions like blood pressure and diabetes worsen during that time period. And it really focused us in on, so here are the elements that we need to work with our clientele because they don't have anybody else right now. They're trying to protect their overall health, but certain other elements are being overlooked. And I came across some studies by a gentleman named Richard Taylor. He's an author and a host of a podcast named Between the Dream. He really focused on his last podcast on the 2020 hump, is how he referred to it, and that we needed to get over that hump and, again, look towards that hope for 2021. And so that's something that we talked about back in the very first episode. We referenced hope as a muscle. So I thought it was a nice connection for our listeners to be able to kind of tie those pieces together. But he talked about needing to recognize the importance of your mental health, looking for avenues of hope. And the one that I highlighted the most out of his conversation was actually embracing power and community. So I feel like that is just a different way to talk about that need for socialization, for connectivity with others. I think it goes back to exactly what you were saying about needing that interaction.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's great on many different levels. Again, the fact that through podcast we can continue to learn new
Absolutely.
things, and so this is a neat one that I'll tune into now. Uh, but that concept of the hump of 2020, that too is I like what's conveyed in that. How are you? How is Brandon Knight dealing with uh, or strengthening his social connectivity today to combat the double pandemic?
Right. I think there are a lot of alternatives. Certainly, they're going to be person specific. What works for me may not work for you, and for you to someone else. But for me, a lot of it has been technology. We've seen a lot of benefits to technology in the last year or so of virtual learning and telehealth services, things like that. But just as simple as scheduling a virtual hangout with some of my friends to say, hey, at 5 o'clock on Friday, we can no longer get together in a large group, but we could all Zoom or Skype or FaceTime with each other for a half an hour and just catch up. So going back and highlighting, we're socially distancing, we're following these things that we need to do, but we're not really socially distancing. We're still having that interaction, that communication. We're even seeing each other's faces and expressions, which tells you a lot about how someone responds to something. But we're physically distancing, so we're maintaining COVID precautions, but we're actually getting the interaction that we need. That's something that I've been doing a lot in thinking about that. I came across some other options for people, so just things that you could consider. They're certainly not, the only options out there, but there are virtual support groups, depending on what you're going through. If you're dealing with loss or grief related to COVID-19 or something else, there are coping groups available right now online for that. There are virtual workout groups. A lot of gyms are offering free classes on yoga or strength training, things that you can do at home with no weights, no tools. For substance abuse concerns, there's AA and NA, which is online right now for a lot of people. Huge community resources. You had mentioned, actually off air once before, that you were dealing with something at home that was helping you to have some sense of structure and normalcy and being connected. Would you care to follow up with that?
Sure. Yeah. So from, I guess, about the time of Thanksgiving, when my daughter returned from UT Chattanooga, so she was home for 2 months, and actually, unintentionally, I think, almost by accident, we got in a habit of playing rummy every night. Now, I didn't know anything about the game of rummy. I didn't know that you could total points and, carry games over from one night to the next. But, quickly it became ritual, routine. Every night, for about 45 minutes, we'd play a couple rounds of rummy. So, my wife, daughter, and I dare not say who won most of those games.
Gonna take it wasn't you.
I'll let my daughter share who was the big winner in that one. But it became sanctuary. Mm-hmm. It became social connection. Became a way to play with each other. And it really promoted, I think, a health, a family wellness, a social wellness that was in short supply when the messaging was distance, distance, distance. So, yeah, I think those kinds of things, and your examples are wonderful examples as well. If I'm watching this, and maybe I've been struggling with loneliness or feeling very isolated, and I also see this helpline up there, and I were to call, what might a counselor who answers that call what might I expect them to tell me, or guidance that they would give me to address my loneliness?
I think we might talk about some alternatives for being socially interactive versus physically distancing from people. You know, we could go through resources like this, or if there were something that you were to say you had a specific interest in, maybe we could provide some additional education in that regard. I think, you know, from a very basic standpoint, just calling the hotline itself, if you're struggling with loneliness, might be helpful on its own, because you're getting someone to listen, you're getting someone who can communicate back to you, you know, someone who can help you process what you're going through. So that's a positive experience in its own. I would recommend that for anyone, but we can certainly focus in on specifics if you're looking for a specific avenue to kind of combat that loneliness.
Yeah. Well, great advice, and I think we underestimate just how valuable a simple phone call can be, and having someone validate that, yeah, in fact, what you are feeling is loneliness.
Absolutely.
And let's talk about it. Well, I'm glad we got to talk about it.
Yes, sir.
It's always good to see you, Brandon.
Same to you.
We appreciate you tuning in. We hope you'll continue to join us. This topic of double pandemic is certainly an interesting one. We hope you found it interesting. And don't forget to like the Ridgeview YouTube page and key the bell, as I've been told, so that you get notified for our weekly podcast. Thanks again. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yes, sir.
And hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.